Welcome to another episode of the Pitch BTCC show. I'm here with our guest, ex-British touring car racer and current World GT Pro-Am champion, Chris Goodwin. Chris, welcome. Thanks for coming along.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me.
So, I mean, you've had a massive career in motorsport, but a key part of that was the British Touring Car Championship, which gave you a few sort of avenues to discover what was going to happen in the rest of your career. But before you got into touring cars, how did you start your race career?
Well, I had a massively long career in motorsport.
Does that mean you're old?
Which is another way of saying I'm extremely old, yes. So my era in BTCC was a long time ago, but it happened to be really one of the high points of the championship in the super touring era. So
that was sort of your super touring car days, 92 to 94 really, but before that you were doing other bits and pieces as well.
When I started in motor racing, I was a kid being used as free labour by my dad, who raced sports cars, and I was a mechanic on his race cars. He was a doctor. He raced quite high level in international racing on the side. Before I was born, they were based. He was a doctor in the Far East in Singapore. He raced in the Macau Grand Prix. Successfully, came to Europe, did endurance racing, which is in the end where I kind of always imagined myself racing. But yeah, when I then finally convinced him to allow me to put the spanners down and, put a steering wheel in my hands, it was a very low level entry. So I rebuilt an old historic road car that turned into a historic racing car, did a couple of races in that.
That was a Turner, wasn't it?
Yeah. So not many people these days have a professional racing career that started in a 1958 Turner, bought for 300 quid. But that was my way in. So, for anyone watching now and wanting to get into the British Touring Car Championship, it doesn't matter where you start, just start and be good at it, or do whatever you can do. And
enjoy it.
Enjoy it
yeah.
And win.
Yeah.
That's it. Find a way of winning something, because everyone likes a winner, and it doesn't matter what you win, because that will help you get into the next stage. So you might be starting in the post-historic road sports car championship, but it might lead on to the next thing. So I did that as a teenager, and then I was in a very fortunate position. I lived in Kent, next to Brands Hatch Circuit. My school holiday and college holiday job was at the racing school as a mechanic. That then morphed into, being there at the right time, at the right place, right time, when they launched the Formula First single-seater category.
And what a fantastic massive careers were made from that.
Well, I think that's when I bumped into you.
Literally.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, actually, definitely. So it was just a real super cheap entry. Again, you couldn't predict where your opportunities come, but there was a chance to get into a modern single-seater car in a championship that was promoted. I managed to get myself onto Top Gear TV. They filmed a documentary about the first season of a young driver getting into motor racing. I think, like you, Shaun, I crashed an enormous amount. I was absolutely out of my depth. Was fast in the car, but shunted it all the time. Didn't know how to race. Worked it. All of the lessons that everyone seems to learn now doing karting, but spending a huge amount more money doing it. Anyway, we did that together. And at the end of that, I won the final race of the season, and that just about got me the chance to drive a Formula Ford 1600 car the next year. One of the sponsors that wanted to be on Top Gear liked it, and then bought me a Formula Ford car that I could run myself the next year. And again, I ran the car myself, so I was very much into the mechanics of the car already at that point. So actually, in the long run, was a great way to be hands-on, understanding the car, rather than just turning up and driving. So again, another real lesson. I think it's very easy to look at the big name drivers these days who tend to have the fast track way into motorsport. Big budget to start with, just buying rides, huge budget rides in karting, single seaters and so on, to get themselves into the highest ends of either touring car racing, sports car racing or single seaters. But it's not the only way. I can name plenty of people that have scrabbled their way through, and sometimes that wider understanding, that broader knowledge of engineering, mechanics and so on can actually help you in the long run.
Well, talking about some of the big names in Formula Ford, I mean, that was quite a big time. The British Formula Ford was really the centre of the young drivers' universe, really. Because, I mean, we've seen pictures of you when we were chatting earlier on. It's you and David Coulthard, Kelvin Burt. I mean, who else were you out? Pedro de la Rosa, was that in Formula Renault? And
Yeah, there were lots of people flying around at that point in time, but in the championship that I was focused on in Britain, it was David Coulthard won that championship. You know, our first race together, I led him for 10 laps out of 12.
He led the two important ones. Yeah.
Exactly, lesson learned. So, that was where I started learning a lot about racing. But Kelvin Burt, who was a big name for a number of years in the BTCC, he was in that championship as well. So we were the top three in that series. And, you know, you start to learn at a very early point really where you are in the pecking order. And even I remember that first race, Brands Hatch, 1989, one of us three was going to be in Formula One. And I knew who it was.
So then after Formula Ford, you did Formula Renault, which went well. I think you finished second in the championship there. And then a big name, but probably wasn't such a big name then. Jason Plato was in Formula Renault at the same time as you.
Yeah, so going from Formula Ford 1600, I raced with a Van Diemen chassis, and that again was a stroke of luck in that was an era where all the cars were different from each other. There were a bunch of different manufacturers making those Formula Ford cars. So I was already into developing the following year's car with Van Diemen. So I spent 2 or 3 winters actually just driving around endlessly at Snetterton, learning how to develop better handling, better performance. And that was, you know, absolute gold dust. That was my education, really. I raced for Van Diemen with a private team the following year in Formula Renault, finished runner-up against all of the Swift cars. Tommy Erdos won the championship in a Swift. Touring car driver, raced Lexus.
I think, yeah.
Third in the championship, Tim Sugden. So he raced for a number of years in he was BMW factory driver, Toyota, etc. in super touring. So, you know, get very competitive stuff. Just again, very good. The whole thing, Formula Ford, all the single-seater stuff was extremely good grounding and education. And I highly recommend in the early years of a driver's career to try and do the most competitive thing he possibly can do, because in karting and early single-seater racing, it's cutthroat. What I also learned was how to do the development and engineering of a car, which I think is quite difficult to achieve now. But it, you know, set me up to then do the next thing. Well, back then the next thing cost a lot of money. It was Formula 3, Formula 3000, and the budgets involved in that were unaffordable, astronomical. But at the same time, just in that very early 90s, this was when the BTCC really exploded. It took off, didn't it? Literally overnight. It had been a big championship, you know, on the side of single-seater racing for quite some time. But, you know, I think I specifically remember that really cool shunt between Steve Soper and John Cleland as one of the things that just, you know, lit the fuse, and everyone wanted to be involved with that championship.
Yeah, but before you got to touring cars, you sort of realised that saloon cars was going to be a bit of a dead end for you. You had a Formula 3000 race or two in the UK, I think, but then you did some saloon car racing and won the British Saloon Car Championship with Saab.
Yeah, so as my single-seater racing tailed off a bit, I did some more Formula Renault and Opel Lotus, and, you know, did all right, but it was clearly the writing was on the wall. Needed to try and get a professional career, and the aim back then, and again I seem to very specifically remember, the target was, and I would never tell him to his face now, was to be like Steve Soper. He was like, that was the role model. He was a professional driver for a manufacturer, had lived a life, international lifestyle, raced all over the world, in fact, for BMW. And I thought, well, that looks pretty cool. You know, Formula One was never on my radar ever since I got trounced by David Coulthard in that first Formula Ford race. Clearly that wasn't going to happen. But I always thought you could make a professional career out of motor racing. And that was the template, something like Steve was doing. And I think he has been the role model for quite a number of drivers. I recently spoke with Andy Priaulx, actually, and that was always that was his target, was to, you know, that was the career to have, and he did do that exactly, mimicked Steve's career himself. But yeah, so what was available to me was You know, I'd met a really lovely guy, Lionel Abbott. He was racing for Saab in the British Production Car Championship. He'd raced in Group N, British Production Car Championship. He'd even raced for Pro Drive in those beautiful Mobile One sponsored BMW M3s. Anyway, he was looking for a second driver in his Saab in the British Production Car Championship. I did those races. We won, helped him win the championship. Saab won the championship. And that was a really good lesson, you know, starting to branch out into something that was totally different.
That had a roof over its head.
Had a roof. Yeah. It didn't handle at all well, because actually touring cars, saloon cars did not handle very well at all back then. They were heavy, low grip, no downforce, very unsophisticated machines in that championship, but you know, also in the main touring car championship itself.
So you had an interesting story that we chatted about for the programme, that one of your teammates is Ian Flux, who went on to do touring cars, probably around about that, maybe a bit earlier he was doing touring cars. Interesting story from the Nürburgring 24-hour race though.
Yeah, Fluxy did touring cars for a long time. He was in the BTCC, in the Sierra Cosworths and all of that era, BMW M3s. But we did the Nürburgring 24-hour race, which was a touring car race back then, in the Saab. There were 4 of us, myself, Lionel, Richard Dean and Lionel Abbott, Ian Flux. Anyway, to cut a long story short, it's a horrendous race. It rains, it dries, it's you know, difficult conditions all the time. Ian was a passenger in the car in the last 20 minutes, destroyed the car with 20 minutes to go. We were doing pretty well at the time. And yeah, I think he travelled out to the race with the team and the mechanics. He had to get a lift from my dad on the way back. I don't think he was too popular with the mechanics.
No, that's right, we've only got a little bit left. So join us after the break when we'll talk to Chris Goodwin about his further career in British touring cars and then where it went from there. So welcome back to the Pitch BTCC show. I'm joined by my guest, Chris Goodwin, racing driver, test driver, British touring car racer, world champion even. So, I mean, it's all going on. But we were talking before the break about how Chris got into motorsport, his career in single-seaters that quickly developed into him knowing that maybe saloon cars is the way for him to improve his career. So after the Saab drive in sort of Group N as it was then, what was your next step? Where did you see your career going after that?
Well, at that moment in time, early 90s, all of a sudden, the British Touring Car Championship just was the only show in town, and town being the world really. Just as it is now, you know, so many young drivers start their motor racing careers even just wanting to aim for the British Touring Car Championship right now. Everyone's trying to get on that grid. Back then, early 90s, everyone in the world was trying to come to the UK, and not just the drivers. I mean, we had Formula One drivers coming this way, guys from Le Mans coming this way, everyone coming from all of the national saloon car championships and so on, all wanted to get on into the BTCC, but so too all the manufacturers. So manufacturers from all over the world were now putting together programs to be on that grid. And so, yeah, it was only show in town. It was the only place you could afford to be. Well, the money was huge. Everyone was earning loads of, drivers were, you know, commanding big salaries. So it was a frenzy really. So yeah, I had to do absolutely anything I could possibly think of doing to get myself into a car. So one of your previous guests here, Gary Ailes, was a good old friend of mine. We worked together as instructors in a racing school, got on as good mates. He was racing in the Italian Touring Car Championship at that moment in time. I went out to visit him a few times, and at the same time as that, I managed to, back here in the UK, convince a few people to let me get into a car just to show what I could do. So I think the very first touring car I managed to talk myself into was a tech speed run BMW, Auto Trader sponsored, quite an iconic car. Marvin Humphreys gave me a test in that. I'm quite good at creating opportunities out of very tenuous connections.
Well, Marvin is still team manager. I think he's team manager with Accelerate Motorsport. He doesn't run his own team now, quite sensibly, as we've found that's probably not the best way of keeping your hair grey or on your head. But yeah, no, he's doing a great. So 30 years later, he's still in the thick of it.
Well, I think, again, just, you know, a bit of advice to anyone that's trying to get there. You've just got to think of any slight remote opportunity or chance or connection and you know, exploit it to the full. So as we've been speaking, I've only just remembered how I ended up in the BMW. So in the single-seater racing, I'd won a championship, and there was some prize drive that gave me a prize drive in a tech speed run Formula 3 car. Got a few laps in that car, got to know Marvin. Anyway, one thing led to another, and I then subsequently talked him into letting me drive this BMW, which was an absolutely awesome bit of kit. So old school compared to what everyone's driving around in now. I remember an H-pattern gearbox and a beautiful BMW 4-cylinder engine. Sounded amazing until I'm pretty certain it blew up while I was driving it. But
Right.
probably quite expensive for somebody. But anyway.
Hopefully Marvin's forgiven you for that by now. 30 years.
We don't talk about it. We don't talk about it. But and then the next thing was I got myself, again, a great opportunity landed on my doorstep. One of the sponsors of the Saab was Grundig, who made cast stereos, kind of an old school company. They also sponsored the Acuria Cos Vauxhall Cavalier team in the BTCC that was operated by RML. Now RML is a massive name in touring car racing. They're multi-champions. They're still involved on the engineering side to this day.
Well, they're really important because they supply all the engineering sort of subframes, wishbones, anti-roll bars, you name it. That part of it is part of the regulations to use those bits from RML.
Well, RML and Ray Mallock particularly were instrumental in really giving me my chance to get into touring cars.
Well, we've got it on the backdrop here, I think. Is this that year? It's so long ago that this is the best quality photo we could find, really. And incredibly, you're in the middle and you've got hair.
Is it actually a photo or is it an oil painting?
You might look better if it was an oil painting nowadays, anyway.
So the late David Leslie, absolutely a legend. He was off at Le Mans racing. The team needed to do a test. They were running a test at Silverstone. The MD of Grundig talked Ray into giving me a run in the car. It went great. It went really well. They had a third car that they'd built up for the Spa 24-hour race, which was back then a touring car race. One thing led to another, and I managed to find myself in the car doing a race at Brands Hatch halfway through the season, and it went really well. It was going really well, This was when it was all kicking off. You know, there were factory Toyotas and Nissans and BMWs and Vauxhalls and so on, Fords. It was like in 1993, it already exploded in popularity, and there I was, and found myself in a car in the race. No real great preparation for it. Worked my way up through the field, and this was when I had a real wake-up call. This is the business end of motor racing. This is where the money is. No one really wants a newcomer coming in and taking the opportunities. So as I was trying to outbreak Alan Menu into Druids in his factory Renault in my little private Vauxhall, I had a wake-up call saying it's not going to be as easy as this. Anyway, I was out of the race at that point. Rubbings racing, as they say, but I'd made an impression and managed to do another race later in the season, the final race at Silverstone. Same car, same deal, same team, and it went even better, and I got driver of the day and made a decent enough impression.
So just going back a step, what's the big difference between a single-seater race car and what was then a super touring British touring car?
Well, back then quite a lot, because you're developing a single-seater which is a bespoke racing car, and it handles well. It's designed for the job. Even back then, the BTCC, these were really converted road cars. They were modified road cars. So I think actually RML really did lead the way in a very new approach to developing a touring car, racing car. And they had a good run of success through the super touring era, because they applied a lot of science to their racing and to their engineering. And I benefited a massive amount over the years through working with them as a result. But back then they were beasts. They were not great handling cars. You really were making big steps in terms of improving their road holding and performance. So not quite the nice handling touring cars that you see on the grid today.
So you moved on to the next year, and then it wasn't quite a full season, but it's your first proper season in touring cars, which went pretty well.
Yeah, but the good stories in between times. So that was great to finish the season on a high. RML were running the private Acuria Cos team, but during that winter they managed to capture the factory contract to operate the Vauxhall factory team, and it was quite a big step for RML, big step financially in terms of support. they inherited the 2 factory drivers from the Vauxhall team, a big budget, and they wanted to expand that into a 3-car team and really go for it. And I was one of the drivers. So every driver's dream, you get the factory deal. I nearly had it. I've got a photo.
And that's with John Cleland and Jeff Allen, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Who were going to be the sort of 2 of the 3 drivers.
Exactly, yeah. And, established names. And this was a very funny time in the BTCC where there was a crossover. So there were a lot of established names in the championship. John Cleland, Jeff Allen, Andy Rouse, all of those guys. But then there were a big influx of new people, younger drivers like me, more established ex-Formula 1 drivers, all flooding into the BTCC. And there wasn't quite enough room for everybody. So in the end, the 3-car factory team turned into a 2-car factory team with a test car and a test driver. But the byproduct...
And unfortunately, that was you.
That'd be this guy, yeah.
Okay.
So that was okay, it was all right. And in fact, what I got was all of last year's scraps. I got the previous year's factory car, attire, supply, engines and so on. So Vauxhall did help me massively to get on the grid in the privateer class the following year. It started a bit late because there was a bit of recovery from the disappointment and then getting going again. But I won a lot of those races in the privateer class, missed quite a few for various reasons. Either we didn't have the budget or I was often testing the factory car.
But that led on to opportunities at the end of the year. But there are opportunities again, and it's a similar story. I mean, a lot of the viewers will think, no, it's a shame that so-and-so isn't in the car today and this, that, and the other. But it's always been the same in motorsport. It's nothing new. People think they're in a seat or get an opportunity, and then suddenly everything changes.
Yeah, so, I think I was quite rightly naive back then, because why wouldn't I be? Because I'm learning the business. But certainly that period of my life, I learned a lot about the motorsport business and business in general, life, So I arrived thinking, right, if I do a fast lap time, that's it. That's all I've got to do. No. You've got to do the fast lap times, but you've also got to play the politics right. The financial setup's got to be all in your favour. You've got to be in the right place at the right time. All of the stars have got to align. So you can be the fastest driver in a car. That doesn't necessarily make it happen for you. In my life, some of the fastest drivers I ever raced against never even sat in a Formula 1 car, whereas some of the slightly more average ones did. But back then, so I made a name for myself, established myself as being a quick, competitive touring car driver, and there were a number of factory contracts waiting at the end of 1994. Honda were coming in, Alfa Romeo was staying for a second year, Vauxhall I thought would maybe be open for me again, and I did tests for all of those people, but ended up doing something totally different.
Yeah, well, we'll have a chat about totally different after that, because it does lead on to it's a bit of a sad story there, but it leads into a good story. So join us after the break, and we'll carry on having a chat to see what it takes to make a career in motorsport. Welcome back to the Pitch BTCC show. I'm joined by ex-British touring car racer Chris Goodwin. We're going to find out a little bit more of how his career went after the British Touring Car Championship. But first of all, in the short time he spent in British touring cars, you probably made quite a big impact. Let's see what that's about. A bit of British touring car history that still gets shown over and over again on the not the bloopers reels, really, but the Crash Fest reels. So, from your point of view, it shows you how competitive the British Touring Car Championship is.
Yeah, the stakes were extremely high, and it was cutthroat, wasn't it? For me, I was desperate to beat any factory car I could possibly beat. You needed to make a name for yourself very quickly. That Mazda team never appeared again. So as they disappeared off the scene, there were fewer professional places for drivers to go, but then Honda came in, other teams were coming in. And at the end of the year, for about an hour, I had a Honda drive, subsequently turned around, and an hour later I got a phone call saying I didn't. The influence of people, money, sponsorship and so on, it was a massive lesson learned in the real how it really works in the motorsport business.
Well, that's right. So, I mean, looking at that you learnt a lot in that short period of time, which was, because I know that at one point or other you were thinking of giving the whole thing up and going to work for Ascom, who was one of your sponsors, or Telenova, was it? One of the two. Anyway.
Yeah, true story. Yeah. So, at one point you're on the one trajectory thinking you were really a shoe-in to get a factory drive. You've done everything you need to do on track, but then the world doesn't work that way. That's the reality of life, But, it's a game of snakes and ladders. So 1 minute it's going well for you, you drop down, but there's always a ladder there waiting for you if you're looking for it. So actually, after the second factory drive I thought I was going to get with ProDrive and Alfa Romeo, David Richards, who's head of Motorsport UK right now, ran ProDrive and that team. He put me in touch with the Lotus factory team. I wasn't thinking about doing GT endurance racing, and all of a sudden a whole new world opened up for me.
No, well, that's really good. Then leading into driver management, you had some really big names you were looking after.
Yes, one of the things I did, so at that point, again, I'd already, through the whole life of touring car world, I'd learned how to develop cars, and I continued doing that with RML for a number of years through their Opel and Nissan contracts. But at the same time, I needed to diversify, so I ended up doing a lot of development. And in fact, it was Ron Dennis that actually said, you know what, this motor racing is just too difficult. It's not a stable environment, and he was not wrong. And I went and worked for McLaren for 20 years developing all of their sports cars and road cars. But in parallel with that, if you've learned lessons the hard way, you might as well put them into practice. So I managed Bruno Senna from Formula 3 through and out the other side of his Formula 1 career. And again, it was lessons learned dealing with manufacturers, dealing with the super competitive world of too many drivers, too few spaces on the grid, that helped get Bruno onto the grid in Formula 1. It's the same deal. And then subsequently I've diversified even further into owning a racing team, which is also something I enjoy a great deal.
Well, that's Garage 59, and they're racing in GTs at the minute. But just going a step back, it's incredible the stuff that you learn when you're in your late teens, early 20s in motor racing. At the time, you just don't think that you're actually learning anything that's going to be any use in your later life. But it soon develops into something that actually, I know all about this, because you think everybody knows about it, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I've just done the Spa 24-hour race last weekend. We ran 3 cars. We had 2 podiums out of three cars. I'm sitting around, massively long week. Team manager for Garage 59 is Julian Rouse, Andy Rouse's son. And we often, talk briefly about, the history. It's amazing. You're doing stuff every day and you can relate it back. So either developing a car or dealing with a commercial issue or drivers or the politics or the TV. I've learned a great deal switching from McLaren. I worked with Red Bull and Aston Martin more recently on the Valkyrie road car program, and all of these complex things I can really relate back to. A lot of people go to school and have a university education, but I think the BTCC was my university education because it taught me everything about the whole business.
Right. And it's interesting what a small world motorsport is, because your number one at the moment, who's working on a car at the moment, is partners with Jade Edwards.
Yeah, Stuart,
who races in British touring
Stuart,
cars.
in between pit stops, was looking at his phone over the weekend, just checking out how she was doing in last weekend's race weekend. So yeah, it's a very intertwined world, and yes, you learn specific lessons as you go along, but you certainly learn never to give up. You certainly learn to understand that you don't know what's around the corner. You're always going to bump into people that you dealt with years before as well. And I have to say, BTCC is fantastic at the moment. I watch it on TV whenever I can because it's super entertaining racing.
Well, looking back at the young Chris Goodwin back in the sort of late 80s, what would be your big advice to him?
Don't give up. Don't give up. Just do everything the best you could possibly do. Don't get too downbeat if things don't work out for you, because that is the thing that I think a lot of people don't understand. It's not enough just to do your job. Don't just expect things to work out for you if you drive the car fast. Every day you've got to have a checklist of things you've got to do. You've got to wake up every day with, knowing that every single day you've got to do something to contribute to furthering your career, as well as being fit, driving fast, you've got to be connected, you've got to put yourself about. I used to travel around the world and go to racetracks just on the off chance that I might meet somebody that might help me to the next stage, literally around the world. So if you can go to bed every night knowing you've done everything you could squeeze into that day to help your career, then you will have a career.
No, it's incredible. I mean, to think about it now, that's how many years is it? 30, 40 years, 30 years, 35 years, something like that. You've been in sort of top level motorsport racing against the best drivers in the world. I mean, last weekend you were at the Spa 24 Hour. How many cars were on the grid? I can't remember. It's like
close to 60.
Yeah, about 50, 60 cars. And there must be 150 drivers, maybe more, who've got the talent on, in the field at some point to have got to Formula One.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, there's some amazing drivers in that category that aren't necessarily known in the UK. There are some drivers that have raced in BTCC. There are some drivers that could race in BTCC. It's an amazingly rich environment for manufacturer support, kind of reminiscent of the Super Touring era. All of the big brands are in that category. It's just obviously it's a privilege to be able to drag these old bones into a race paddock and drive in a professional environment and still be able to do well. But it's all about that education that kicked off back in those BTCC races in the early 90s, and the contacts and the lessons learned subsequently that still stand me in good stead today.
No, exactly. Well, join us after the break when we're joined by Matt Salisbury from inside BTCC. He's going to be having lots of stats about last weekend's race at Alton Park, which looked a little bit of a crash fest, but it wasn't as bad as it looked in some ways, but also some stats on Chris. Because Chris is so old, there are a lot of stats to look at. But join us after the break. Thanks for joining us again on the Pitch BTCC programme. I'm joined here by Chris Goodwin, who's here telling us all about his motorsport career. But also we've got Matt Salisbury from inside BTCC, who's got all the stats you could ever possibly want about British touring cars. Matt, what can you tell us about Alton Park?
Well, before we look at Alton Park, you've kind of got a guest there who was on the grid when I first really got into British touring cars back in the early 1990s, and 1994, which was Chris's first full season, is one that a lot of people look at as a really memorable one for one big reason, and quite literally a big reason, because of the Volvo 850 estate. And I'm just curious from Chris's point of view, when people talk about that season and talk about that car, people always talk about the element of surprise when it turned up for the season launch. As someone who was on the grid racing against it, how much of a surprise was it for you when a factory team suddenly rolled out an estate car?
Well, I started that season late. I'd missed the launch and the first race of the year, but showed up in my first race and I was right behind them on the grid. So the surprise was what an amazing tow you got when you were right behind two estate cars. It was awesome. So they were the factory cars that were along with the Nissans and the Mazdas were the ones. They were the scalps I wanted to capture as a private car. You could just about nibble away at them, and yeah, the tow that the Volvos gave was pretty fantastic.
Well, it's incredible to think when you think the different cars that they had then. I mean, on British Touring Car Grid now, there is a big variety of vehicles, but they tend to become a little bit similar, I suppose, in design. Sometimes you can't always tell the difference between a sort of a Hyundai and an Audi on the road. Sometimes maybe it's just me. But then to have an estate car on the grid, that's a huge change of engineering philosophy. But I think it was really marketing led. I think
it was marketing led. It was their first year as a manufacturer in the BTCC. They wanted to make an impression, even though they didn't think they'd be at the very sharp end of the grid. So why not do something different? Think outside the box and race something that looked a bit like a box. And it did. It got them loads of headlines, and they did their first season with no real massive expectations, and then second season onwards they were a lot more competitive, weren't they?
So Matt, how about Alton Park then?
So Alton Park, a few interesting things came out of it. The obvious one being that we had a first-time winner in Dan Rowbottom. Gordon Shedden was probably a little bit disappointed that Dan got that win, because I think if we hadn't had the red flag, it would have been Gordon getting his first victory since coming back into the championship. But for Dan, first win for him, and by my records, that makes him the 149th driver to win a BTCC race. So if we get a first-time winner when we go to Knock Hill, then they've got a pretty impressive record that they'll be able to put next to their name.
Well, that definitely resonated with the Pitch BTCC users because they went on the app, they voted Dan Rowbottom driver of the day, and I thought he was my driver of the day as well. Adam Morgan did a great job as well because, I mean, he scored a big, huge rack of points. But it was a little bit of a crash fest at Alton Park. I think anybody who avoided any of that going on did really well. But well done for Dan Rowbottom for winning driver of the day.
Yeah, and it wasn't just his first overall win either. It was the first time that he'd taken an independence class victory. The same was true for Senna Proctor in that regard as well, because Senna's previous victory in the championship came when he was driving for Power Max Racing when they were a Vauxhall factory team. So Dan and Senna become the 59th and 60th drivers to take independence class victories as well. The independence class having come in not long before Chris there started racing in the championship. So been since the early 90s we've had the independents.
Well, that's right, because back in the time that you were in there, they had the Privateer Cup, if you like, which was probably about 5-6 cars maybe of the grid. Because the thing is, everybody looks back with rose-tinted spectacles of British touring cars from the super touring era. But I remember going to races then, and they weren't always the best motor races you'd ever see. But because you had that edited highlights done sort of on the next weekend's grandstand with Murray Walker doing his usual fantastic job on the microphone, it really built up a massive following.
Yeah, there was a big spread in performance across the cars. I mean, as an example, I drove a Privateer Vauxhall from the previous year's car, but tested the factory Vauxhall. They looked quite similar. There was Silverstone Grand Prix circuit testing for the British Grand Prix support race, 2 seconds a lap difference between the two cars, same driver. So we still managed to make some good racing out of it, though.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic, fantastic. And what else have you got for us, Matt?
If we look at the places that were gained across Alton Park, 3 big names were the drivers who made up the most places: Tom Ingram, Jason Plato, Josh Cook. Ingram made up 18 places. That was because of the fact in qualifying he obviously didn't take part, so he had a lot of work to do in the races. Jason had to recover from disappointing race at the start of the weekend. Josh Cook also had his fair share of issues and had to come through the pack. And it's actually a big name who's made up the most places over the season when we're 4 rounds in Gordon Shedden. 55 places he's now made up this season, ahead of Tom Chilton. Both of those have had difficult qualifying sessions. If you think back to Snetterton, Gordon was at the back of the grid, so he had to come through the field. Same as at Thruxton, where he had an incident in race 1 and had to come through. And Tom not really got a handle on that BMW in qualifying yet, so he's been left to make up places on race day, and that's reflecting the fact he's made up 52 spots so far. Gordon, 3 places more, he's done 55.
Well, going into the weekend at Alton Park, there was Ash Sutton and Tom Ingram, who were probably 30 to 40 points ahead of the next place man. But because they had a pretty poor weekend by their standards, hardly scoring any points at all, it's closed the top 7 or 8 up, and we've got some new names. And one of those names is Dan Rowbottom, who's jumped up to 3rd in the standings. He's only about 20 points behind the leaders now. So it was all changed last weekend, and I think when we come to the end of the season, Alton Park will be seen as one of the races that really decides the championship.
I think that's probably a fair thing to say. I actually spoke to Dan for the magazine about 3 weeks ago when we were at Alton Park for the test, and I said to him, "You've got to be pleased with how it's gone so far." And he was like, "Yeah, I'm pretty am. You know, I'm quite close to Ash at the top. I'm ahead of Gordon in the standings." And I said to him, "Do you need to now reevaluate what your hopes are for this season? Because at the start of the year, it was like, if I can get into the top 10, regularly get in top 10 finishes, push into the top 6, maybe get a reverse grid by the end of the season, you know, see how I get on." All of a sudden, he was like, "I think I do need to reevaluate what I'm aiming for from this season. When I'm so close at the top, even though there's a long way to go, do I need to aim higher than the Jack Sears Trophy?" And I think if you look at it after Alton Park, where, you know, he's won that first race, he's finished on the podium in race 2 when he's got weight on board, and he's only 12 points now away from the championship lead, you've got to say, Rowbottom's got a chance.
Well, definitely. I mean, I think that's what everybody loved about the British Touring Car Championship back in your day, but also today it's much the same, is that it's all changed. Every weekend something new can be thrown into the mix, and the racing is so close that suddenly somebody who looks like to be winning a race is suddenly tipped off into the boonies, if you like. So that ruins their championship day. But I mean, the big thing last weekend, we had fans back, which is brilliant to have all the fans back in the paddock, walking around the track. It was great to see, and we had the drivers' parade as well. But one way to get involved with the British Touring Car Championship, which is different in your day, because we've got social media nowadays, Chris. So do you know what social media is? So I know you're a bit of a technophobe on that front.
I don't believe in that.
Well, I didn't think you did. So what we've got is the Pitch BTCC app, which users can download. They can vote for their driver of the day. They can ask questions to the drivers on the Pit Time app section of the user technology, which is all going on there, but also lots of behind the scenes. They get to vote on who's going to get fastest lap and who's going to get pole position, who's going to win each race. So make sure you download the Pitch BTCC app to get involved in the conversation. Well, anything else, Matt, that you've got from Alton Park to entertain us with?
Well, just as you talked there about the fans being able to vote for who they think is going to get the fastest lap and who's going to get pole position, be curious to see how many people guessed that Tom Ingram would get a fastest lap over the course of the weekend. The Hyundai had never had one. So quite good, I suppose, for Accelerate that the first fastest laps came on the first time that the car was racing in front of a full crowd. And the same for Senna Proctor. Curious to see how many would have gone for him for pole, because he'd never had a pole position. And that was also the first pole for his car. It was the first time that car had won a race and the first time it had led a lap. So a few interesting things that people maybe wouldn't have expected that came true over the autumn weekend.
Well, it's quite interesting because I spoke to Tom Ingram and also Christian Dick from Speedworks, which is also Toyota Gazoo Racing UK. There we are, I can get that out in one sentence. But both of those guys, because obviously they've worked with each other for a long time in British Touring, neither of them have had a podium at Alton Park. So that carried on with Tom Ingram, but obviously Speedworks, they won a race with Rory Butcher. So that's a big change for them, and Christian looked particularly happy about that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's good for Speedworks. It takes Toyota onto 38 victories in the championship, so it moves them level with Renault in the record books. They're climbing up a little bit, but like you say, it was good for Speedworks to get a win. Would have been nicer for them if Rory hadn't ended up being taken out of race 3 when Carl Bordley had his issues. So that was an unfortunate way. But you mentioned Tom Ingram there. I spoke to Tom at the end of the weekend and I said, disappointed with how it's gone. And he said, well, it could have been a lot worse. I've had a pretty rubbish weekend and I'm still second in the championship, and Ash hasn't really pulled out any points on me. Okay, the guys behind have closed up, but we're still in a good position. I think the only thing he has to do is wonder who he's upset at Alton Park in the past, because like you said, it's the only place where he's never managed to get on the podium in the BTCC so far.
So looking on to the next meeting, we've got Knock Hill there. Now we've come from a circuit that everybody was talking about it being a rear-wheel drive specialist, but we didn't have any rear-wheel drives on pole position, didn't have any rear-wheel drives winning races. But Knock Hill has been predominantly a rear-wheel drive track, but it's, from what you said earlier on, Matt, Honda have got the most race wins there. So what I was going to ask, Chris, Knock Hill, what's it like in a British touring car? I know it's nearly 30 years ago now that you last went round there, but I know you tested there for Vauxhall.
Yeah, funnily enough, nothing's changed. It's a very particular racetrack, quite aggressive, and it's always a key race weekend. Back then, we would test there for the entire week. I didn't even race in that race weekend because Vauxhall were really pushing to win that race. So I didn't race my own car, but spent the week testing the factory car. And inadvertently, actually, we tested some new stuff, that smaller rear wheels on the back of the Vauxhall Cavalier, inadvertently testing some suspension geometry that gave rear toe out and rear steer. Well, that's something that's really prevalent now, and is a standard thing that the BTCC cars use. But it was super effective then. The only cars quicker than us and the only car quicker than me in testing was the factory Joe Winkelhock BMW. So it's always been a strong rear-wheel drive circuit. You've got to get out of the hairpin quick, but the tight, twisty nature and the curbing there and the bumpiness is what's important. But you say that BMW, the rear-wheel drive cars, might be the quickest. you've still got to race, and it's a very unforgiving racetrack. It's not a lot of space to go side by side, is there?
So thanks very much to our guest, Chris Goodwin, who's been really informative. Let us know exactly how we should have been doing a motor racing career. I wish I'd spoken to you 35 years ago. I might have been in Formula One, but I don't think you're actually that good. But to get me to Formula One. Thanks very much, Matt. Well, I'd like to say thank you for joining us for this Pitch BTCC programme. Look forward to seeing you after our trip to sunny Scotland at Knock Hill.